Hi, this is Gus Lukowski, and in this video we'll look at Units 6 and 7 as part of our APUSH review, Part 2. So with that said, some of the main ideas here of Period 6 is that we're going to see laissez-faire principles really take hold of this period where there are very few protections for workers from the federal government and very much cozy with big business. And of course, this is known as the Gilded Age. We're going to have our Carnegies, Morgans, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, better known as captains of industry, or if you take a more negative approach here, robber barons. And of course, some are going to utilize vertical integration, where they're going to buy up all of their suppliers, while others are going to utilize horizontal integration, where they're going to buy up their competitors. Now, some of them, of course, took an approach of the gospel of wealth, where they saw themselves as having a greater, higher calling to sort of spread out that wealth and give to charity. And that's why a lot of these names still have charitable organizations today, such as the Carnegie organization and the Rockefeller organization, as some of the more charitable ones that still exist today. But they also believed in social Darwinism, basically the idea that the strongest, wealthiest businesses should survive and the other ones should just basically die off, similar to that idea of evolution. Now, the federal government is going to often protect and promote business, and we see this in particular with the Great Strike of 1877. President Hayes is going to call in federal troops to intervene and even put down labor violence. And similarly, Cleveland will intervene in the Pullman strike. So you see big business being backed by the government. Now, the working class is going to organize unions in a pushback to hopefully get business to give higher wages, lower hours, and we see this with the Grangers in particular, where these farmers are going to come together asking the federal government for more regulation, and in particular to stop against discriminatory railroad rates against the small or quote-unquote little guy. Now, we'll also see other unions, such as the American Federation of Labor by Gompers. We also see the American Railway Union by Eugene Debs, who will reappear, the Knights of Labor in particular. And one of the things that's going to be somewhat beneficial is the Interstate Commerce Act, and this is going to be the beginning of at least some regulation. We also have the Sherman Antitrust Act, and that was also the beginning to go after big business, although it lacked many teeth. So period 6 is really a bad period for workers, but we're going to see period 7 as trying to correct that, in particular during the progressive era. And then reforms are going to be part of the populist and democratic platforms. The Populist Party in particular wanted a graduated income tax. We'll see that eventually with the 16th Amendment. And we'll also see the direct election of senators. We'll see that with the 17th Amendment. And for their own purposes, the Populist Party is also going to demand unlimited coinage for silver to create inflation, which would increase prices in particular for the farmers. And in the 1896 election, we're going to see the Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who's going to be very influential with this cross of gold speech. Of course, he will not win. However, this is going to, again, usher in a number of populist reforms we will see in the progressive era. Now, by the turn of the century, we're going to have a second wave of immigrants from the southern and eastern parts of Europe, and this is going to spark a nativist backlash. We'll have many push and pull factors, and of course, we have a lot of nativism rising once again. We'll have the KKK. We'll also have the Chinese Exclusion Act. And we'll also see that there are going to be organizations from the American Protective Association to the Immigration Restriction League that are going to be formed as anti-immigrant. Now, that's not to say that we do not see, some reform movements to help immigrants. In particular, we'll see the social gospel movement. We'll also see the rise of settlement houses by Jane Addams, who directly is outreaching to poor immigrants. We'll also see politicians such as Boss Tweed in the use of political machines to offer services such as to poor immigrants in exchange for votes. Now, we will see that the rise of discrimination will continue. We'll see Jim Crow laws. We'll see, of course, the awful decision of Plessy v. Ferguson. Lynching still occur. We also see the use of grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes. And this ushers in a big debate between Booker T. Washington, who's going to be infamous for the Tuskegee Institute, where he's going to say that blacks need to develop more economically to eventually gain rights. That is sort of a slow and gradual approach is the way to do it. Whereas W.E.B. Du Bois is going to offer saying the complete opposite, saying we want rights right now. And there, of course, highlights sort of the growing contrast between those two. Nevertheless, we're going to see the Great Migration as there is going to be thousands of African Americans from the South moving northward to cities such as Detroit and New York City to escape poverty, to escape more of the racism. Not to say that there was not racism in the North either, but of course you could eke by much better. We'll also see the rise of the NAACP, arguably the most prominent organization for civil rights at this point in history. Now, let's move on to period 7. Imperialism is now going to captivate the United States as the U.S. is looking to acquire land internationally. We'll see the use of that for commercial reasons, military purposes, even though there's the idea of social Darwinism. There's also a feeling of religious motivation there, and jingoism, of course, nationalism. We'll see this starting with the annexation of Hawaii. We'll also see this continue in with the Spanish-American War. If you recall, of course, with yellow journalism, the USS Maine blowing up, the Loam Letter, and we'll even see Teddy Roosevelt make an appearance with the Rough Riders. And of course, originally remember with, in particular, Cuba, that the United States says they were basically looking not to annex a territory, but of course, their motives are going to change this. And again, when you contrast the Teller and the Platt Amendments, you sort of see the United States changing its tune a bit. After the Spanish-American War, of course, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines will be used as territories, and this is going to create a Supreme Court case known as the Insular Cases, ruling that just because they are a U.S. territory does not give them citizenship. All right, now moving on to foreign policy, we're going to see this dramatically shift since the time of Washington. And of course, remember with Washington, he's all about isolation and, no foreign treaties unless they're commercial in nature. We see that sort of remaining somewhat consistent with the Monroe Doctrine, but of course that goes a little step further by saying no European interference in North or South America. Now bring in Roosevelt with the Roosevelt Corollary that the United States would use force to protect the economic interests in Latin America. And of course, he's famous for his quote of "speak softly but carry a big stick." And then his predecessor, Taft, of course, is going to bring about the dollar diplomacy, where the United States is going to guarantee loans made to countries by U.S. businesses to promote their own commercial interests. And this is going to be scaled back a little bit under Wilson, who is going to usher in missionary diplomacy that would deny recognition to any Latin American government that is undemocratic or hostile to American interests. Now, period 7 is also going to bring about the progressive era, and we really are going to see this takes effect here, that we're going to see a lot of changes in social welfare and moral improvement, economic justice for greater efficiency in the United States. This is in thanks in part to muckrakers. We also are going to see the rise of the temperance movement, and that's going to come to fruition with respect to the 18th Amendment. Also part of the progressive era, local and state reforms. We have initiatives, referenda, recalls. We have the progressive amendments with the 16th Amendment, with the income tax, 17th Amendment with direct election of senators, 18th, as we just mentioned, with prohibition, and then finally, after World War I, the 19th Amendment with women's suffrage. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, being perhaps the hallmark president during the progressive era, is going to, of course, have the square deal, where he's going to be protecting consumers, controlling monopolies, and also being really well known for the conservation of the environment. He is, of course, a trust buster of what he would call, quote-unquote, bad trusts. He's very much known under his presidency when the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act are going to be created, and also with conservation, the New Lands Act. Now, under Taft and Wilson, they're going to continue their progressive reforms. Of course, we do know that there's a split between Taft and TR, but what's interesting is Taft actually prosecuted more trusts than Roosevelt, although he's not going to care as much when it came to conservation of land. Now, Wilson, even though he's going to be a Democrat, is going to continue on with the progressive era. He's going to attack what he calls the triple wool of privilege, which was trusts, tariffs, and high finance. He's even going to have the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is much stronger than what we talked about with the Sherman Antitrust Act, going after big monopolies, and is even going to create the Federal Trade Commission. Now, despite attempts for the United States to remain neutral, we do know that the U.S. is going to be dragged into the First World War thanks to the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmermann telegram, amongst other causes. Now, this is going to bring about total war where the United States is going to be mobilized as a country. It's going to be mobilized under the War Industries Board, the Food Administration, and you're even going to have propaganda being produced under the Committee of Public Information. And keep in mind, during wars, we tend to see civil rights and liberties be dwarfed, and we see this especially with the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Now, following the end of the World War, the Treaty of Versailles is going to arguably lead to the rise of Hitler, and of course it's going to bring about World War II. But Wilson is going to write his 14 points, which is advocating for a League of Nations. Now, many senators in the United States, known as the Irreconcilables, are very much against it. They don't want to give up the United States' sovereignty and are going to be against that. Remember, Wilson's 14 points are very, very much idealistic. Now, during the 1920s, we're going to see anti-immigration sentiments continue to flare up, in particular with the Italian immigrants of Sacco and Vanzetti, who are going to be executed. We're also going to see the Emergency Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924, so interesting comparison to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then, of course, the 1920s is very well known for prohibition taking effect, and a lot of the enforcement mechanisms came about under the Volstead Act. But despite this, we're, of course, going to see the rise of speakeasies, bootleggers, moonshiners, and, of course, there's Al Capone, of course, knowing that there's a black market and also gangs that are going to arise thanks to this prohibition. Now, in period 7 too, during the 1920s, we have pro-business presidents who are going to continue with laissez-faire, sort of somewhat similar to the Gilded Age. That's going to be with Harding and Coolidge, where you're going to see low taxes, very little intervention in the economy, encouraging consumption of consumers. And of course, you're going to have the Teapot Dome scandal, which of course you're going to see some corruption in which land is going to be given out in the form of a bribe in return for money. Now compare this to Grant, for example, whose presidency was a little bit mired with corruption as well. So an interesting synthesis if you are asked to do so. But perhaps the biggest issue here is going to be the Great Depression under Hoover, which is going to lead to very little direct relief for many Americans. In fact, there are going to be the rise of Hoovervilles, these poor homeless settlements that are going to be taking Hoover's name. Now, bring in FDR, who's going to have his New Deal, the 3 R's, focusing on relief, recovery, and reform, and he's going to bring about a myriad of different what are known as alphabet soup of programs, the AAA, TVA, CCC, and then he's even going to bring in a second New Deal, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, for example, and it's not going to be a rubber stamp type of legislation. Not everyone's going to be with it. It's going to be even challenged in court. And FDR is going to try to pack the courts. That's very controversial. Of course, that will not succeed. But you see that, nevertheless, that FDR is going to try to put forth that strategy. It's not to say that we do not have long-lasting programs that date back to the New Deal time frame, such as Social Security, the FDIC, the SEC in particular. Now, the United States, of course, is going to attempt to remain isolated once again during the Second World War, but it's really going to be unable to. You look at the Neutrality Acts when it tries to, the quarantine speech by FDR, and then, of course, they're going to be leaning towards the British with cash and carry and the Lend-Lease Act. But, of course, Pearl Harbor is going to be the game changer, and you're going to have sort of similar ties with the Office of Price Administration, war bonds. Certainly, you're going to have, once again, the dwarfing of civil rights. Look at, for example, the internment of Japanese Americans. However, at the end of the day, this was a very diverse war effort when you look at the Navajo Code Talkers, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 442nd Regiment, and then ultimately this will come to a conclusion with Truman and the dropping of the atomic bomb. You're probably not going to see in this DBQ anything about relating to particular battles. That's going to be more of a AP World History, AP European History type of DBQ, not for AP US History. But the big idea of World War II is that the United States is going to emerge a superpower. So these are some of the main ideas and some of the evidence. Be very familiar with them. I wouldn't focus on anything nitty gritty, but certainly have the main ideas covered that we talked about in periods 3 through 7, and you should be in good shape.